My wife spent $21,000 trying to hide her affair from me. I discovered this after months of weird charges on our credit cards and bank statements that made no sense. She told me they were for work expenses or gifts for her sister, but something felt off. When I finally pieced together the hotel receipts, restaurant bills, and cash transfers, I realized she had been funding an entire secret relationship. The worst part wasn't just the cheating, it was how much money she burned through to keep me in the dark. Now I'm sitting here with a stack of evidence that could destroy our marriage, wondering if I should confront her or just quietly file for divorce. Either way, our joint savings account is basically empty, and I have to decide what to do next. So I'm David, 38, accountant. I work at a mid-sized firm downtown doing tax prep and bookkeeping for small businesses. My wife Sarah and I have been married for 12 years, and honestly, things had been pretty normal until about 6 months ago. I'm the type of guy who pays attention to numbers. It comes with the territory when you spend all day looking at spreadsheets and financial records. So when our household expenses started getting weird, I noticed right away. Sarah had always been the spender between us, but she usually kept it reasonable. The first thing that caught my attention was our credit card bills jumping up by like $800 a month. When I asked Sarah about it, she told me work had been requiring more client dinners, and she was getting reimbursed later. That made sense since she works in sales for a marketing company. But then the reimbursements never seemed to show up in our checking account. When I brought it up, she said her company was slow with expense reports and she'd follow up with HR. I figured corporate bureaucracy was just being corporate bureaucracy. We live in a decent suburb about 20 minutes from downtown. Nothing fancy, but our mortgage is manageable and we both make good money. Sarah drives a newer Honda. I have an older Toyota that runs fine. We're not rich, but we're comfortable, or at least we were. The whole thing started unraveling on a Tuesday evening when I was doing our monthly budget review in my home office. I was sitting in my home office around 7:30 on a Tuesday evening, going through our monthly expenses like I always do. Sarah was in the living room watching some reality show about housewives. I could hear her laughing at the TV drama while I pulled up our credit card statements on my laptop. The Visa bill was higher than usual again, which had been happening for months now. I started going line by line through the charges, and most of them looked normal. Grocery store, gas station, her usual coffee shop. But then I saw a charge for $500 at some place called Elite Concierge Services. I had never heard of Elite Concierge Services, and $500 seemed like a lot for whatever that was. I called out to Sarah and asked her what Elite Concierge Services was. She yelled back from the living room that it was probably something for work, maybe event planning stuff. That didn't really satisfy me, so I kept digging through the statement. There were 3 more charges I didn't recognize over the past 2 months. A $400 charge at something called Metropolitan Executive Suites, another $300 charge at Prestige Personal Shopping, and a $200 charge at Luxury Car Rentals. I walked into the living room and sat down next to Sarah on the couch. I asked her about these specific charges, reading them off my phone. She barely looked away from the TV and told me they were all work-related expenses that would get reimbursed eventually. I pressed a little harder and asked why she needed to rent luxury cars for work when she had her own car. She got slightly irritated and said sometimes clients expected a certain image, and her company encouraged employees to present themselves professionally. She told me I was being paranoid about money again. The thing is, I wasn't being paranoid. I'm an accountant. I know what normal business expenses look like, and this wasn't it. But I also didn't want to start a fight over what might be legitimate work costs. I went back to my office and decided to look at our other credit card, the MasterCard we barely used. That's when things got really weird. There were charges on there too, ones I definitely hadn't made. A $600 charge at some high-end restaurant downtown. Multiple charges at expensive clothing stores. Even a charge for $200 at a place called Romantic Retreat Spa. I sat there staring at my laptop screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Sarah's explanation about work expenses was starting to sound less and less believable. What kind of job requires romantic spa visits and luxury car rentals? I decided to check our checking account next, just to see if any of these supposed reimbursements had actually come through. I logged into our online banking and scrolled through the past 3 months of deposits. Sarah's regular paychecks were there, but I couldn't find any expense reimbursements from her company. My stomach started to feel tight. Something was definitely wrong here, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. I thought about confronting Sarah again, but I knew she'd just give me the same work excuse. Instead, I decided to start keeping track of these unusual charges. I opened a new spreadsheet and started documenting everything that seemed out of place. The Elite Concierge Services charge, the Metropolitan Executive Suites, all of it. If these really were work expenses, there should be a paper trail somewhere. I spent another hour going through our statements, and by the time I was done, I had identified almost $3,000 in questionable charges over the past 3 months alone. That was a significant chunk of money, way more than Sarah's usual spending. When I finally went to bed that night, Sarah was already asleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell was going on with our finances and why my wife was being so evasive about these charges. The next morning I got up early and made coffee while Sarah was still getting ready for work. I figured I'd try a different approach and see if I could get more information without sounding accusatory. When she came into the kitchen, I asked her how things were going at her job and if the client entertainment stuff was still keeping her busy. She poured herself coffee and said work was fine, maybe a little more demanding than usual, but nothing she couldn't handle. I mentioned that I'd noticed some of the expense charges hadn't been reimbursed yet and asked if she wanted me to call her HR department to follow up. Sarah immediately got defensive and told me she could handle her own work expenses. She said I didn't need to get involved in her job stuff and that the reimbursements would come through when they came through. Her tone was sharper than it needed to be, which made me more suspicious. I tried to keep things casual and asked about the romantic retreat spa charge specifically. I said I was just curious what kind of work event would involve a spa. Sarah's face went a little red, and she told me it was a team-building thing with her female coworkers. That explanation didn't make much sense either. Sarah had never mentioned team-building spa days before, and $200 seemed expensive for a group activity. But I just nodded and said that sounded nice. After Sarah left for work, I decided to do some more investigating. I went to my home office and pulled out our filing cabinet where we keep important documents. I found our folder of credit card statements going back about a year and spread them out on my desk. Looking at the older statements, I could see exactly when the unusual spending started. About 6 months ago, our monthly credit card bills jumped from around $1,500 to over $2,000. The increase was gradual at first, but it had been getting worse every month. I made a list of all the unfamiliar charges and started Googling the company names. Elite Concierge Services turned out to be some kind of luxury personal assistant service. Metropolitan Executive Suites was a high-end hotel downtown. Prestige Personal Shopping was exactly what it sounded like, expensive personal shopping services. None of these businesses made sense for Sarah's job. She worked in marketing, not some executive position that would require luxury concierge services. And even if her company did pay for expensive client entertainment, why would she need personal shopping services? I decided to call Elite Concierge Services directly and see what I could find out. I told the receptionist I was calling about a recent charge on my credit card and wanted to understand what services had been provided. She asked for my name and credit card number, and after a few minutes on hold, she came back and told me the services were for romantic dinner arrangements and gift deliveries. My heart started pounding. Romantic dinner arrangements? That definitely wasn't a work expense. I asked for more details, but the receptionist said she couldn't provide specific information without authorization from the person who had booked the services. I hung up the phone and sat there trying to process what I'd just learned. Sarah had spent $500 on romantic dinner arrangements, and it wasn't for us. We hadn't been to any fancy romantic dinners lately. In fact, we'd been eating at home most nights because I'd been trying to save money. I called the Metropolitan Executive Suites next and got similar information. The charges were for hotel room bookings, but the receptionist couldn't give me dates or details without proper authorization. Same story with the luxury car rentals. They confirmed the charges were for vehicle rentals, but wouldn't provide specifics. By the time I finished making these calls, I was starting to feel sick to my stomach. Everything pointed to the same conclusion, but I didn't want to believe it. Sarah was having an affair, and she was spending our money to fund it. I spent the rest of the morning going through more statements and making more calls. The pattern was consistent. Luxury services, expensive restaurants, hotel bookings, all charged to our credit cards over the past 6 months. The total amount was staggering when I added it all up. When Sarah got home from work that evening, I tried to act normal, but I could barely look at her. She asked if everything was okay, and I told her I was just tired from work. She seemed relieved that I wasn't asking more questions about the credit card charges. Later that week, I decided I needed more concrete evidence before I could confront Sarah about what I suspected. I took a long lunch break on Thursday and drove downtown to the Metropolitan Executive Suites Hotel. I figured if I could get some kind of documentation about the hotel stays, it would give me a clearer picture of what was happening. The hotel was one of those fancy places with marble floors and expensive artwork in the lobby. I approached the front desk and explained that I needed copies of receipts for charges that had appeared on my credit card. The desk clerk was polite, but told me they couldn't provide detailed information without proper identification and authorization. I showed them my driver's license and credit card, proving that the charges had been made on my account. After some back and forth with a manager, they agreed to print out basic receipt information for the dates in question. What I saw made my stomach drop. The hotel receipts showed that Sarah had booked rooms on multiple occasions over the past 4 months. Always on weekdays, always for single nights. The rooms were expensive suites, not basic hotel rooms. Each stay had cost between $300 and $400, plus additional charges for room service and spa services. I sat in my car in the hotel parking lot, staring at these receipts and trying to figure out what to do next. The evidence was pretty damning, but part of me still hoped there might be some innocent explanation. Maybe Sarah really was using these rooms for work meetings or client entertainment. But then I noticed something else on the receipts. Several of them showed charges for 2 key cards, not 1. If Sarah was using these rooms for legitimate work purposes, why would she need 2 room keys? I decided to drive by Sarah's office building to see if I could spot her car. She had told me that morning that she had back-to-back meetings all afternoon and would probably be working late. Her Honda was nowhere to be found in the company parking lot. I felt like I was losing my mind. Here I was, sitting in my car like some kind of private investigator, spying on my own wife. But the evidence kept piling up, and none of it pointed to innocent explanations. I drove home and went straight to my office to look through more financial records. I pulled up our joint checking account and started looking for any unusual withdrawals or transfers. That's when I found something that made everything even worse. Over the past 6 months, Sarah had made multiple transfers from our joint savings account to her personal checking account. The transfers ranged from $500 to $1,500 each, and they happened about twice a month. When I added them up, she had moved over $8,000 from our joint savings into her personal account. I had never paid much attention to these transfers because Sarah occasionally moved money around for various reasons. But looking at the timing, these transfers always happened right before the big credit card charges appeared. She was essentially funding her affair with our joint savings. The total amount of money Sarah had spent was staggering when I calculated everything together. Credit card charges, cash transfers, hotel stays, luxury services. It was well over $15,000 in 6 months. And that was just what I had discovered so far. I sat there in my office feeling completely betrayed. It wasn't just that Sarah was cheating on me. She was using our money, our joint savings that we had worked years to build up, to pay for her affair. Every romantic dinner she bought for some other guy, every hotel room she booked, every expensive gift she purchased, it was all coming out of our shared finances. I thought about all the times over the past few months when I had suggested we cut back on spending or skip a vacation to save money. Meanwhile, Sarah was blowing thousands of dollars on her secret relationship. The financial betrayal felt almost as bad as the emotional betrayal. That night when Sarah came home, she seemed nervous and asked if I had been calling her office. I told her I hadn't, which was technically true since I had only driven by her building. She relaxed a little, but still seemed on edge. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but I realized I needed to be smarter about this. If Sarah was willing to spend this much money to hide her affair, she would probably lie and deny everything when confronted. I needed to gather more evidence and figure out my legal options before I made any moves. The following Tuesday evening, I decided to test Sarah's honesty by bringing up our finances in a casual way. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, and I mentioned that I'd been thinking about our budget for the upcoming year. I told her I was concerned about how much our monthly expenses had increased lately. Sarah immediately got defensive and asked what I meant by that. I explained that our credit card bills had been running about $500 or $600 higher each month, and I was trying to figure out where the extra spending was coming from. She told me she hadn't noticed any significant changes in her spending habits. When I mentioned some of the specific charges I'd found, she got irritated and accused me of micromanaging her purchases. She said she was an adult and didn't need me monitoring every dollar she spent. I tried to stay calm and explained that we were supposed to be partners in managing our household finances. I said I wasn't trying to control her spending, but I needed to understand where our money was going so I could plan our budget properly. Sarah's response was to turn the whole conversation around on me. She accused me of being obsessive about money and said I was making her feel like she couldn't spend anything without getting interrogated. She told me I was being paranoid and controlling, and that my behavior was starting to affect our relationship. This was classic gaslighting, and I recognized it for what it was. Instead of explaining the charges or addressing my concerns, Sarah was trying to make me feel like I was the problem. She was making me question whether my concerns were reasonable, when I knew damn well they were. I decided to push a little harder and asked her directly about the Metropolitan Executive Suites charges. I told her I was confused about why her work would require expensive hotel stays when her office was only 20 minutes from our house. Sarah's face went red, and she told me those charges were for out-of-town client meetings. She said sometimes her company required her to meet clients in neutral locations, and hotels provided professional meeting spaces. When I asked which clients and which cities, she became vague and told me she couldn't share confidential client information. The lies were getting more elaborate, but they still didn't make sense. Sarah's company primarily worked with local businesses, and she had never mentioned traveling for client meetings before. Plus, the hotel charges were always for single nights in our own city, not out-of-town trips. After our conversation, I went back to my office and decided to check our bank records more thoroughly. I logged into our online banking and started looking at Sarah's personal checking account, which I had access to since we'd set up all our accounts jointly years ago. What I found there was even more damning evidence. Sarah's personal account showed regular cash withdrawals of $200 or $300, always around the same time as the hotel charges. She was also making payments to credit cards that I didn't know existed. I spent the next hour digging deeper into our financial records. I discovered that Sarah had opened 2 additional credit cards in her name only, using our home address, but without telling me about them. The statements for these cards were being sent electronically to an email address I didn't recognize. I couldn't access the detailed statements for these cards, but I could see the payment amounts coming out of her personal checking account. Based on the payment amounts, she was carrying significant balances on these hidden credit cards. When I added up everything I had discovered, the charges on our joint credit cards, the transfers from our savings account, the cash withdrawals, and the payments on the hidden credit cards, the total amount was approaching $20,000. Sarah had spent almost $20,000 in 6 months on her affair. I sat there staring at my computer screen, feeling completely numb. This wasn't just cheating. This was financial fraud on a massive scale. Sarah had systematically drained our joint accounts and taken on secret debt to fund her relationship with someone else. The worst part was realizing how long this had been going on and how carefully planned it was. Sarah hadn't just fallen into an affair and made some impulsive purchases. She had opened secret credit cards, moved money between accounts, and created elaborate lies to cover her tracks. This was premeditated deception. I thought about confronting her with all this evidence, but I realized I needed to protect myself first. If Sarah was willing to commit this level of financial fraud, she might be capable of other things too. I needed to talk to a lawyer and figure out what my options were before I made any moves. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the times Sarah had kissed me goodbye in the morning before going off to spend our money on another man. All the times she had come home and acted like everything was normal while hiding thousands of dollars in secret spending. The betrayal felt overwhelming. By the weekend, I was a complete mess. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and I was having trouble concentrating at work. Sarah kept asking if I was feeling okay, and I kept making excuses about being stressed about a difficult client. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was lying to cover up the fact that she was lying. Saturday night, we were getting ready for bed, and Sarah was in the bathroom doing her skincare routine like everything was normal. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what to do next. The evidence was overwhelming, but I still hadn't decided how to handle it. Part of me wanted to confront Sarah immediately and demand an explanation. But another part of me knew that confronting her without a plan would be a mistake. If she was willing to steal $20,000 from our joint accounts, she might try to hide assets or take other steps to protect herself if she knew I was onto her. I had been thinking about calling a divorce lawyer, but I wasn't sure if that was the right move either. Maybe there was some way to work through this, though I couldn't imagine how. The financial betrayal was so extensive that it felt impossible to come back from. I decided I needed to talk to someone who could give me objective advice. My brother Mike was a lawyer, though he specialized in corporate law rather than family law. But he would at least be able to point me in the right direction and help me understand my options. Sunday morning, I told Sarah I was going to play golf with Mike, which wasn't entirely a lie since we did sometimes play golf together. I called Mike and asked if he could meet me for lunch instead. I told him I needed some legal advice about a personal matter. We met at a quiet restaurant where I knew we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. I explained the whole situation to Mike, showing him some of the evidence I'd gathered on my phone. He listened without interrupting, occasionally shaking his head or raising his eyebrows at particularly shocking details. When I finished explaining everything, Mike was quiet for a minute before responding. He told me that what Sarah had done was definitely grounds for divorce, and that the financial fraud might even have criminal implications. He said I needed to talk to a family law attorney as soon as possible to protect my interests. Mike also advised me to start documenting everything more systematically. He suggested I gather copies of all the financial records, take screenshots of the bank transfers, and create a timeline of Sarah's spending. He warned me that Sarah might try to hide or destroy evidence once she realized I knew about the affair. The most important advice Mike gave me was to be strategic about how and when I confronted Sarah. He said I should have a clear plan for what I wanted to achieve before I revealed what I knew. Did I want to try to save the marriage? Did I want a divorce? Did I want to pursue legal action for the financial fraud? I realized I hadn't really thought through what my end goal was. I'd been so focused on gathering evidence that I hadn't considered what I actually wanted to do with that evidence. Mike suggested I take some time to think about it and maybe talk to a therapist to help process everything. He also recommended that I consult with a family law attorney before making any decisions. He gave me the name of a lawyer he knew who specialized in complex divorce cases involving financial fraud. He said I should at least get a consultation to understand my legal options. When I got home that afternoon, Sarah asked how my golf game went. I told her it was fine and that Mike and I had mostly just talked about work stuff. She seemed satisfied with that explanation and went back to watching TV. I spent the rest of the weekend thinking about what Mike had said. The idea of divorce felt overwhelming, but I couldn't see how we could possibly work through this level of betrayal. Sarah hadn't just cheated on me. She had systematically stolen from our joint finances to fund her affair. By Sunday night, I had made my decision. I was going to call the family law attorney Mike had recommended and schedule a consultation. I needed to understand my legal options before I decided how to proceed. I also decided to be more systematic about gathering evidence. I spent several hours that night creating detailed spreadsheets of all the suspicious charges, taking screenshots of bank transfers, and organizing everything chronologically. If this ended up in court, I wanted to have thorough documentation of Sarah's financial fraud. Monday morning, I called the family law attorney Mike had recommended. Her name was Jennifer Walsh, and she had been practicing family law for over 15 years. Her assistant was able to schedule me for a consultation that Wednesday afternoon. I took a half-day off work and drove to Jennifer's office downtown. She had a professional but warm demeanor, and I felt comfortable explaining my situation to her. I brought printed copies of all the financial evidence I'd gathered, organized in neat folders. Jennifer reviewed everything carefully, asking detailed questions about our joint accounts, Sarah's employment, and the timeline of the suspicious spending. She seemed particularly interested in the secret credit cards and the systematic transfers from our savings account. After reviewing all the evidence, Jennifer told me I had a very strong case for divorce based on adultery and financial misconduct. She explained that in our state, courts could consider financial fraud when dividing marital assets, which meant I might be able to recover some of the money Sarah had spent on her affair. Jennifer also explained that I had several options for how to proceed. I could confront Sarah directly and try to work things out, though she didn't recommend this given the extent of the financial fraud. I could file for divorce immediately and serve Sarah with papers, or I could gather additional evidence first and then proceed with legal action. She recommended that I gather as much evidence as possible before Sarah became aware that I knew about the affair. Jennifer suggested hiring a private investigator to document Sarah's activities and potentially identify her affair partner. She also advised me to secure copies of all our financial records and consider freezing our joint accounts to prevent further unauthorized spending. The consultation lasted about 2 hours, and by the end, I felt like I had a clear understanding of my legal options. Jennifer agreed to represent me if I decided to proceed with divorce, and she gave me a detailed plan for how to move forward. I drove home that afternoon feeling more confident about the situation. Having a legal strategy made me feel less helpless and gave me a sense of control over what happened next. That evening, Sarah seemed particularly affectionate, which struck me as suspicious given everything I now knew. She suggested we go out for dinner at a nice restaurant, and normally I would have agreed. But knowing that she had been taking other men to expensive restaurants with our money made the suggestion feel insulting. I told her I wasn't feeling well and suggested we just order pizza and stay home. Sarah seemed disappointed but didn't push the issue. We spent the evening watching Netflix, and I found myself studying her face, wondering how she could act so normal while carrying on such an elaborate deception. The next day, I decided to take Jennifer's advice about gathering more evidence. I called a private investigation firm that she had recommended and scheduled a consultation for Friday afternoon. I also spent my lunch break at the bank, requesting copies of all our account statements for the past year. Thursday evening, I was in my office organizing the new bank statements when Sarah came in and asked what I was working on. I told her I was preparing our tax documents early this year, which wasn't entirely false since I did need these records for tax purposes. Sarah seemed nervous about me going through all our financial records so thoroughly. She asked if there was anything specific I was looking for, and I told her I just wanted to make sure we had everything organized properly. She lingered in the doorway for a few minutes before going back to the living room. That night, I noticed Sarah was on her phone more than usual, texting someone. When I asked who she was talking to, she said it was her sister planning a family get-together. But I could see from her body language that she was lying. I was starting to think that Sarah suspected I was onto her. Her behavior had become more nervous and defensive over the past few days. I realized I needed to move quickly before she had a chance to cover her tracks or hide more evidence. Friday afternoon, I met with the private investigator, a professional woman named Carol who had 20 years of experience in matrimonial investigations. She reviewed my evidence and agreed to conduct surveillance on Sarah for the following week. Carol explained that her goal would be to document Sarah's activities and potentially identify her affair partner. She said this kind of evidence could be valuable in divorce proceedings, especially when significant marital assets had been spent on the affair. By Friday evening, I had assembled a comprehensive legal team and strategy. I felt ready to move forward with confronting Sarah, but I decided to wait until Carol had completed her surveillance work. I wanted to have every possible piece of evidence before I revealed what I knew. The following Wednesday, Carol called me with her surveillance report. She had documented Sarah meeting with the same man on 3 separate occasions over the past week. They had lunch at an expensive downtown restaurant, met at the Metropolitan Executive Suites Hotel, and spent an afternoon at a luxury shopping center. Carol had taken photographs and video of these meetings, clearly showing Sarah and her affair partner together in intimate situations. She had also identified the man as Robert Chun, a client from Sarah's marketing company. This explained how Sarah had been able to justify some of her expenses as work-related. Armed with this final piece of evidence, I decided it was time to confront Sarah. I scheduled a meeting with Jennifer Walsh for Friday afternoon to finalize my divorce strategy, then planned to confront Sarah that evening. Friday morning, I transferred half of our joint checking account balance into a separate account in my name only. Jennifer had advised me to protect my assets before Sarah realized I was filing for divorce. I also gathered copies of all our important financial documents and stored them in a safety deposit box. When I got home from work Friday evening, Sarah was in the kitchen making dinner. She seemed to be in a good mood, humming while she cooked. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal given what I was about to do. I waited until after dinner, then asked Sarah to sit down in the living room because I needed to talk to her about something important. She looked concerned and asked if everything was okay. I told her it wasn't. I started by showing her the credit card statements and bank records I compiled. I explained that I discovered all the unauthorized charges and secret spending over the past 6 months. Sarah's face went pale as she realized how much evidence I had gathered. Initially, Sarah tried to stick to her work expense story, but when I showed her the private investigator's photographs of her with Robert Chun, she broke down and admitted to the affair. She started crying and apologizing, saying it had been a mistake and that she wanted to work things out. But when I showed her the full extent of the financial fraud, the $21,000 she had spent on her affair, Sarah's demeanor changed completely. She became angry and defensive, accusing me of spying on her and violating her privacy. She said I had no right to hire a private investigator or go through her personal accounts. I explained that they weren't her personal accounts. They were our joint accounts, and she had been stealing from them to fund her affair. Sarah argued that she had every right to spend money from our joint accounts, and that I was being controlling and abusive by monitoring her spending. The conversation escalated quickly. Sarah accused me of being a terrible husband who was more interested in money than in our relationship. She said the affair was my fault because I had been emotionally distant and focused on work. She claimed that Robert understood her in ways that I never had. I remained calm and told Sarah that regardless of any problems in our marriage, stealing $21,000 to fund an affair was unacceptable. I explained that I had already consulted with a divorce attorney and would be filing papers the following week. Sarah was shocked that I had already taken legal action. She begged me to reconsider and suggested we try marriage counseling instead. But when I showed her the timeline of her spending and explained how systematically she had deceived me, she realized that I wasn't going to change my mind. The conversation ended with Sarah storming out of the house, saying she was going to stay with her sister for a few days. I told her that was probably a good idea and that she should expect to receive divorce papers within the week. Sarah received the divorce papers the following Tuesday. Jennifer had filed on grounds of adultery and financial misconduct, requesting an unequal division of assets due to Sarah's fraudulent spending. The papers also included a detailed accounting of the $21,000 Sarah had spent on her affair. Sarah's initial response was to hire her own attorney and fight the divorce. Her lawyer argued that the spending had been from joint accounts that Sarah had every right to access, and that my surveillance of her activities was an invasion of privacy. But Jennifer had anticipated these arguments and had prepared a strong countercase. She presented evidence showing that Sarah had deliberately concealed her spending, opened secret credit cards, and lied about the purpose of her expenses. The private investigator's documentation proved that the money had been spent on an extramarital affair, not on legitimate marital expenses. The case went to court 3 months later. Sarah's affair partner, Robert Chun, was called as a witness and confirmed that Sarah had paid for their hotels, dinners, and other expenses. His testimony was particularly damaging because it showed that Sarah had been using marital assets to support another relationship. The judge was clearly unsympathetic to Sarah's position. During the proceedings, he commented that the systematic nature of Sarah's deception and the large amount of money involved made this more than just a typical marital dispute. He noted that Sarah had essentially stolen from the marital estate to fund her affair. In the final settlement, I was awarded 65% of our marital assets, including our house and most of our savings. Sarah was required to pay back $12,000 of the money she had spent on her affair, though I knew I'd probably never see most of it. The divorce was finalized 6 months after I first discovered the suspicious credit card charges. The legal fees were expensive, but Jennifer had warned me that would be the case. The financial recovery and the sense of justice made it worthwhile. During the divorce proceedings, I learned even more disturbing details about Sarah's affair. It had been going on for over a year, not just 6 months as I had initially thought. She had been planning to leave me for Robert, but wanted to drain our joint accounts first to give herself financial security. The most shocking revelation was that Sarah had actually been planning to file for divorce herself, but had wanted to spend down our assets first, so there would be less to divide. Her affair spending had been a deliberate strategy to transfer marital money into her personal benefit before ending the marriage. Looking back, I realized that Sarah's behavior over the past year made much more sense in this context. Her emotional distance, her defensive attitude about money, her sudden interest in expensive clothes and activities, it had all been part of her exit strategy. The hardest part of the whole experience wasn't the financial loss or even the betrayal. It was realizing that the woman I had been married to for 12 years was capable of such calculated deception. Sarah hadn't just made a mistake or fallen into an affair. She had systematically planned to defraud me and abandon our marriage. A year after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop near my new apartment, reviewing my financial situation. I had recovered better than I expected from the divorce. My living expenses were lower now that I was on my own, and I had been able to rebuild my savings account. The apartment I rented was smaller than the house Sarah and I had shared, but it felt more like home than that house had in years. I had decorated it simply, with furniture that I actually liked rather than compromised choices from married life. I still worked at the same accounting firm, but I had gotten a promotion 6 months after the divorce. My boss had noticed that I seemed more focused and energetic at work once my personal situation stabilized. The irony was that getting divorced had actually improved my career prospects. Dating had been challenging at first. The experience with Sarah had made me much more cautious about trusting people, especially when it came to financial matters. I had gone on a few dates, but nothing serious had developed yet. My therapist said that was normal and that I shouldn't rush into anything new. The therapy had been helpful in processing everything that had happened. I had struggled with feelings of guilt and self-doubt for months after discovering Sarah's affair. Part of me wondered if I had somehow driven her to cheat by being too focused on work or not paying enough attention to our relationship. But my therapist helped me understand that Sarah's response to any problems in our marriage had been completely disproportionate and unacceptable. Even if I had been an imperfect husband, that didn't justify stealing $21,000 or conducting a year-long affair while planning to abandon the marriage. I had also learned to recognize the warning signs of financial deception that I had missed with Sarah. In future relationships, I planned to be much more careful about maintaining separate accounts and monitoring joint expenses. The experience had made me more cautious, but also more confident in my ability to protect myself. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had confronted Sarah earlier, when I first noticed the unusual spending. Would she have ended the affair and tried to work on our marriage? Or would she have just gotten better at hiding her activities? I concluded that it probably wouldn't have made a difference. The level of planning and deception Sarah had engaged in suggested that she had already checked out of our marriage emotionally. The affair and the financial fraud were symptoms of deeper problems that couldn't